is now thought of as illusion by most modern people. We no longer think of ourselves as measured and defined by all that is, but as the measurers and the definers. We have forgotten that there's a limit to what we can manipulate, a limit to changing the world. That limit is God.
Here's a man who's putting into words what you're feeling about your life today, your concerns, your doubts, your hopes. He's a public philosopher, a broadcaster, a writer, a teacher, trying to see how we live today. What have we lost in national and political life? What have we lost in the dynamo of technological society? What have we lost in how we know what's right and what's wrong? The wisdom of the philosopher in the muddle of modern life.
I remember people used to try to figure George out because they wanted labels on him. I wonder whether he was a conservative or whether he was a socialist or whether, and they were because George was always examining things in terms of questions and made people very uneasy. I remember one boy who walked out of the class one day, he got so disturbed.
He takes hold of real questions, which sounds idiotically simple, but the great bulk of writing on any subject does precisely not do that. And perhaps it's one of the areas where he's close to genius.
I just think he knows what the world is like very well, just very well. He's not naive about the world. I think when he says that he's ambiguous about technology, it's part of that sort of realism.
Any person who would want to become Prime Minister of this country should try to put into practice what Grant is saying philosophically, and he will be Prime Minister.
He comes with such a tremendous moral authority, with such vivid and sometimes almost staccato bursts, with such penetration of the issues that it takes all one's moral energy simply to listen and to understand.
He's only published 5 books, I think, which is not a great deal. I mean, if you total it all up, it might be 1,000 pages. And German academics do that in their first 6 months, I think, after they get their degrees. But there's a vitality there, but it's such a subtle vitality that it doesn't come across that way. It comes across rather as a brooding, ruminating. He's like a geyser that an insight's liable to come out any time, but you're never quite sure when it's going to emerge.
On behalf of the University of Toronto, and by virtue of the authority...
Here was yet another honor, but George Grant's ideas reach far beyond universities.
That's part of his magic, you could say, that you meet him at a certain time and then suddenly he lights everything up for you, or as he would put it, he lights up so that you can really see how dark it is.
George Grant lives at the center of the dynamo, at the hub of the mammoth technological machine that is this continent.
All I know is North America, so that is what I write about. I would love to live in the country, but I have to earn my living in the city.
This steel town is on the Great Lakes, Hamilton, Ontario. Does it look familiar?
Some people like women, some like men, some like alligators. But we all do it in Holiday Inns, the same from one end of this continent to the other.
What makes it all the same? Technology, a way of looking at the world only as raw material for the reshaping of everything to suit man. My will be done. But what about those who don't have any power? What about their rights? What happens to justice in the Dynamo?
Canada was built on British ideas of decency and moderation and order.
John A.'s national dream. Now it's gone the way of almost everything else. American. Hamilton's university is McMaster.
McMaster is one of the mass tough universities. It's built on the model of places like Caltech and Michigan State. It's the North American pattern. It's a kind of gas station. The teacher is the attendant at the pumps, and education becomes, fill it up.
It's a fortress factory for the assembly line production of more servants of technology. And what's technology? It issues from what we now call science. It combines knowing with making. It gives man power over nature and power over other people.
In North America, our fate is rooted in technology.
George Grant teaches at a university built on an American model, and many of the faculty are American or American trained.
And one thing that I've been taught, I think, is the enormous confidence that the American teachers here have in the destiny they're bringing to a lesser people. And in that sense, it's very hard for Canadian students not to be swept up into that destiny.
The beginnings were different. William McMaster founded this school about 100 years ago and meant it to be a liberal arts college. Hidden away in the multiversity, there are still reminders of the old ways. This is where George Grant teaches, in the Department of Religion.
I just think you have to look for the university within the university and find the people. I just know that I've always found youngsters who are interested in ultimate questions. They're always there, and those are the people I want to teach.
And how does George Grant teach? Certainly not by fill-it-up methods. His models are Socrates and Plato.
Education is, after all, a word which comes from Plato's image of the cave. Education is a leading out of the darkness of opinion into the light of knowledge, out of the shadows and the imaginings of the cave into the truth. A dear old bird once told me, go into every class with the sureness that there is somebody brighter and with a nobler heart than yourself in the room. And that's all. You don't know who they are, of course.
Whether you distinguish between the good and justice, or whether you are equating those terms. Is justice a more limited term than good?
Certainly, I'm sure good.
I think probably that he cares so deeply about what he teaches. It's the thing that makes him sort of kind of mumble and stutter in class, but that I see as taking things very seriously and kind of trying to speak carefully about things. And so the same thing that might make you lose patience because the seminar doesn't seem to be going anywhere is exactly the right thing, because things are being thought about carefully and discussed carefully. In order for us to even survive as human beings, in a sense that man as man must be just to himself and to others.
Quite.
And perhaps there really is no great difference then between those two.
Quite. Well, I think what I would say to that is the following.
It was like I had things that I needed to think about, but I had no words in which to think about them. And it's as though I've been given the words, the way of looking, the way of seeing that was necessary to be able to think.
The position you put forward as contractual was the view that justice is a convenience so that we can live together necessarily, and the state
Well, you load it by saying convenience, perhaps condition.
Condition, right. Well,
And
just,
is that
yes.
different from the ancient account?
Yes,
that man
I
as
see,
man
quite right.
I always am reminded of Helen Keller's teacher who taught her, and all of a sudden the connection was made that this was a way of being able to speak, of making sense of what was going on. And someone who can give you that's to me what a teacher is, who can take the sort of muddle of your mind and make it slightly less muddled.
I suppose the word good I'm using as synonymous with the word God, might I? You know, as I've said all the time, teaching is an erotic art. And if the erotic part is gone, then it is nothing.
What do you mean by the word erotic?
Oh, what do I mean by the word erotic? Love of the other in their being. I just mean loving the other being for what they are. That isn't present in universities, and if it isn't present in schools, they might as well close down the shop as far as I'm concerned. I mean, let's say I had an English friend here the other day, and he said, "You're always yakking on about justice. I'm so bored with justice, I don't want to be just to anybody. I just want to get on with my love life." It isn't very just. I mean, surely it would be, and I agree with you what you're saying. But I mean, how would you say it? All one can say is what one wants for one's students is that all of them should be what they are meant to be. I think I have a Canadian-Scottish temperament, and I think I'm up and down, and therefore my life is full of great blacks and great whites. I don't mean this at the philosophical level, but I mean at the level of mood. And I get enormous, during the 60s, students were always saying that you couldn't be a professor of religion if you didn't take LSD. I said, I just don't see that, I don't need it. I don't feel the need for it, at a certain point I feel too, listening to Bach or Mozart. I don't want any drugs that is sheer ecstasy. The only time I've ever felt unfaithful to my wife was once listening to Mozart. I felt such love. Mozart to me is just the lute of God. Mozart must have had an eternal model. His music is like partaking in eternity.
George and Sheila Grant live next door to Hamilton, in Dundas. Socrates, as you know, had this fear of writing and the sense that you lost the truth in writing, that speech was much greater. But somebody said, why did Plato write? And the answer is Plato had greater courage than Socrates. That the act of writing was an act of courage in a certain sense. My daughter Kate made this. I love owls. Not just because the owl is the symbol of philosophy, but
But they're such fascinating creatures, and you so rarely see them round here anymore. I just happened to have an owl on my mother's inkwell, and then I began to get all these others from my children. Who took my hand?
I did. You dirty little sleaze. Play your aces.
The Grants had 6 children, and now grandchildren have started to appear. Family and friends try to get together every summer at the place they still love best, Terrence Bay, Nova Scotia.
Queen, Katie.
Willie must have a good hand.
This is really a lay down. Do you want me to lay it down?
Yeah, you can lay it down if you can.
2 of those, that.
No, that is not good.
Oh, no.
So take it back.
Wait a minute. Well, there's one. Wait a minute.
Good
1,
try.
2, 3, 4, 5, and 2 diamonds. Nietzsche said that to be a married philosopher is a matter of laughter. I don't believe that. I mean, I think it is good to be in the world. I've loved my children. It has, taught me a lot. It is inconceivable to me not to be a parent. Do you see what I mean? It is, I'm not saying this well, but one learns a great deal from being a parent.
There's a lot of the artist in George Grant, and his friends include Alex and Rhoda Colville. They all love the sea.
Almost everybody sits and looks at the sea. I mean, this is something that you don't have to have a PhD to do that, and to have essentially the same kind of thoughts about it as George has. I would like to think that the guy who works in a garage or something on a Sunday sits by the sea and has similar thoughts.
Well, it is for me the perfect place. Just rock and sea, sort of bare elements, or just light and shape. In that sense, it's sort of an image of eternity for me. I feel very deeply rooted in Nova Scotia. My ancestors came here from Scotland. My grandfather Grant preached here in Halifax before Confederation, and then left the Maritimes for Ontario and built up Queen's University in Kingston. He wanted education to be available to everyone. I just take democratic education for granted.
George Monroe Grant was one of Canada's builders. He shared John A. Macdonald's faith in progress and his loyalty to British ideas of justice and political democracy. Canadians rejected American republicanism, too anarchic. They wanted a more orderly society. George Monroe Grant went on the first CPR survey, ocean to ocean, and he saw Canada begin to take shape. Canada would have a central place in the British global system. Another Grant grew up, William, a teacher and historian.
And my father married Maud Parkin, one of the first women to graduate from McGill University.
She too was rooted in education and progressive British traditions. Her father, George Parkin, another Maritimer, was principal of Upper Canada College in Toronto and went on to become head of the worldwide Rhodes Scholarship Trust. When the new century dawned, it was called Canada's century. But William Grant, in his 40s, went off to battle, riding a horse. His wounds went deep.
My father was made, in the beautiful sense of the word, cynical by the Great War. He began to see through the world.
So did the poet, Wilfred Owen.
The undone years, the hopelessness, think how it wakes the seeds. Woke once the clays of a cold star, our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerves still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall?
Was it for this the clay grew tall? My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity.
All a poet can do today is warn. Two days before the armistice, Wilfred Owen was killed.
2 days after the armistice, George Parkin Grant was born. George Grant grew up between two world wars, the youngest of 4 children. They were all made aware of the economic injustice all around and the need for profound political change. His father had become principal of Upper Canada College.
One of the sadnesses of my life was that when I was just entering my teens, my father died.
Maud Parkin Grant was a woman of great strength. Her faith was in the doctrine of progress.
My parents had been in public life in Canada. Their parents had been in public life in Canada. They assumed that I would be in public life in Canada. In that sense, I was programmed for the practical, programmed for the progressive.
In 1939, the program took George Grant to Oxford to study law on a Rhodes Scholarship. That same year, 21 years after the armistice, Canada took time to remember the First War. A young king and queen came to Ottawa to unveil at last a monument to the war to end all wars. 1939. It was as if the First War had never ended. George Grant left law and Oxford for a more immediate practicality. He worked as a pacifist with the ARP, Air Raid Precaution, near the dockyards of London's East End.
I think it was the period of my life when you know what it is to live poetically. I don't think I thought at all. I was enormously engrossed. Violence was happening all the time. I mean, I just lived night and day. This was a very intense period in my life, of this bombing period. I just was working night and day.
When the worst of the Blitz was over, George Grant, still a pacifist, joined the Merchant Navy. His health began to give out, tuberculosis. So he became a farm worker in England.
You used to have to set out in the morning, at about 5 in the morning, on a bicycle to ride to the farm. And you know, in England, there are gates across the roads. And all I can say, really, is that I opened the gate, got off the bicycle, opened the gate, went through it, shut the gate. And it just came to me that I thought God is. You know, and it has never left me. Now, I wasn't thinking very much at that point. It just came to me. I've been thinking about it afterwards. I've said that it came to me that I was not my own. You know, it came to me, or in other words, I would use, beyond space and time there is order. All I can say is that happened at that moment, and it has always since sustained me.
Revelation.
I was in Toronto, and I remember everybody was cheering. I really never cried so much on a day in my life. It was the sense of the ruin that the war had been. People who had died and people I'd loved, and I remember I felt very lonely in Toronto that day. And I felt very far from the rejoicing at the end of the war. I just felt, oh God, this bloody business.
Was it for this the clay grew tall? All a poet can do today is warn.
Oxford after the war was sheer enjoyment for me. I just fell in love with my wife. I read Henry James. I didn't do my work. I just had a lovely time. I then had to go and get a PhD because my children started appearing. You know, you have to earn your living some way. But it was, Oxford after the war was just for me a wonderful, beneficial rescuer.
It was even more. War had helped him to begin to see through the world, to question what we mean by progress. How did we come to be where we are? And where are we going?
How can one live in the world if one hasn't thought about what is true about the whole?
It was the birth of a political philosopher. His subject would be Canada and the world we live in. His question, what had happened to Canada? What George Grant wrote touched students, writers, publishers, politicians, and the public. But what exactly was his lament?
What a tragedy the First World War was for Canada. I don't mean just the personal tragedies, but the breakup of Western civilization, except as a slick capitalist enterprise. In the blood and horror of the Great War, Western Christianity came to an end. That war was a total mistake. It was a mistake for Canada to take part in it. It divided us, and by weakening Britain and France, it weakened our ties with our parent nations. Together with the Second War, it strengthened the role of technology in our lives. And it opened the way for new ties to the richest, most technological nation in the world.
The doctrine of progress was still inspiring and building Canada. But who would foot the bill?
No small country can depend for its existence on the loyalty of its capitalists. Canada is a political creation. But the question is whether political institutions have any bite against the demands of technological capitalism. Is this country run from buildings like that, or is it run from the towers of Bay Street, or for that matter from Wall Street and Chicago?
I have always felt at home in Canada. And you, I think, have always felt at home in the United States.
Canada and the United States have reached a point where we no longer think of each other as foreign countries.
Your country, my country. Each is a better and stronger and more influential nation because each can rely upon every resource of the other in days of crisis.
Geography has made us neighbors. History has made us friends. Economics has made us partners. And necessity has made us allies.
It is time for us to recognize that we have very separate identities, that we have significant differences, and that nobody's interests are furthered when these realities are obscured.
What had happened wasn't a secret sellout by wicked men without public assent. Many Canadians believed that Canada could only cope with its poverty, could only progress by trading Canadian resources for American capital. That economic development is good, is really what we're here for. That a higher standard of living would make us better people.
I was brought up to believe that advancing technology goes with advancing humaneness.
And the most advanced technology was American. Lament for a Nation raised other questions about Canadian leadership.
I want to know where I stand. I want to know where you stand, too. That's what I want to know.
Mr. Diefenbaker had his flaws, but he was a strong public champion of our nationalism that was beginning to slip away. The book about dear Mr. Diefenbaker, I wrote it for, the motive that got me up there was anger at what they were doing to the old bird. Do you know what I mean? And that is a very negative, it's an unphilosophic motive, to put it mildly, anger.
I am wounded, but I am not slain. I lay me down and rest a while, and then I'll rise and...
I think Lament for a Nation is, in a sense, a kind of novel. He had to have a person on whom he could fix, and this person becomes Diefenbaker. And in a sense, George wrote a kind of, what I would call a kind of novel, in which Diefenbaker is the protagonist, And this was a way, it's a kind of an extended metaphor or something like that.
The loss that George Grant lamented went even deeper and farther into the past, right back to Canada's beginnings.
John A. hadn't projected American republicanism simply out of loyalty to the founding peoples of Canada. MacDonald saw clearly that Canada should avoid brutality, like the brutality of the American Civil War, that British ideas of moderation and order could create a better society here in the North.
You'll never die, John A. The national dream was fading.
On several points, his negative analysis in great depth has produced positive and curious and unexpected reactions. I begin, for example, with the Lament for a Nation in 1965. He said Canada was finished, Canada had had it, Canada was dead. And it was the threshold of the entire nationalist movement in Canada.
I think the problem of Canadian unity is not so much a French problem as an English problem. I think English-speaking Canada finds it very difficult to know what it is and to know why it doesn't want to be American.
The Québécois problem is this. Although Cartier had been MacDonald's partner in creating one Canadian nation out of two Canadas, Today, Quebec is struggling to keep its roots. And without roots, without tradition, there is no freedom.
Quebec faces a crisis whether French civilization can continue to exist in the midst of English-speaking North American capitalism. People have a right to love their own. They come to love particular goods through loving their own. Of course, they have to move beyond these particular goods to the universal good, which is God.
Why is it so hard today to know who we are, where we come from, and what we are here for?
The modern age has destroyed as living options all traditions but itself. So people must try to understand the past in the hope of rediscovering what has been lost in the dynamic present.
The dynamo dissolves. Technology breaks down boundaries, obscures traditions, and homogenizes societies everywhere.
Well, one of the important features of Grant's influence is that he made the Canadian dilemma sufficiently important to have universal significance. For him, Canada was a close-up of a process which was going on a worldwide basis. The triumph of technology, of the multinationals, the homogenization of human society. But one could see it in more advanced form in Canada. One could see it in a more dramatic way because it was the end of a country.
I think there are many signs which indicate that Grant's analysis pertinent to Canada and to the American Empire are coming to the fore in many other jurisdictions in the Western world. We see on the one hand what Grant calls the process of homogenization. We all become alike. Next to the process of a reaction against the homogenization. That is how I see the reaction of the Scottish people and the Welsh people and the Breton people in France and the Basque people in Spain against the process of homogenization from out of an economic technology that imposes a common lifestyle upon us. So I think that there will be many people in the future who will be echoing the words of George Grant lament in their cultures. And that to me is a hopeful sign.
I had been many years in Halifax teaching at Dalhousie. Driving in from the Toronto airport, I remember being gripped in the sheer presence of the booming, pulsating place which had come to be there since 1945. What did it mean? Where was it going? What had made it? How could there be any stop to its dynamism without disaster? And yet, on the other hand, without a stop, how could we possibly avoid disaster? Students were asking questions then, too, in the 1960s. Questions about Vietnam.
I speak as a Canadian nationalist.
I remember the teach-in in Toronto.
The United States is a world empire, the largest to date. Its life at home is controlled by mammoth corporations, private and public, and through these bureaucracies, it reaches out to control a large proportion of the globe and soon beyond the globe. The 19th century idea of the democratic citizen, making the society inhabits by the vote and the support of political parties, must have less and less meaning in such an empire. Now, I am not advocating inaction or cynicism. Nothing I have said denies for one moment the nobility of protest. Nothing I have said denies that justice is good and that injustice is evil and that it is required of human beings to know the difference between the two. To live with courage in the world is always better than retreat or disillusion. Human beings are less than themselves when they are cut off from being citizens. Indeed,
I felt very close to the students of the 60s, I must admit, because of their saying no to certain things about North American life, which I think they were right to say no about. Now, the students now are much more and I mean this is a good word, much more wary. You know, they're wary of what is going on in the world. Now that wariness is a great theoretical quality. It's a bad practical quality, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think
Wary, yes. But when you grow up in the Dynamo, is it possible to see it clearly? In Technology and Empire, George Grant digs deeper into its history.
I was overjoyed that we'd had the privilege of publishing a book like this. I assumed that the Nobel Prize would be delivered to him sort of within 10 days of publication, which didn't happen. But I was just awed that a book of this stature, we'd had anything to do with it. But 2 weeks later, he phoned up, and I think he was wondering if a copy could be sent somewhere. I don't remember just what the details were. But I picked up the phone, and this voice came through, going in all these different directions. Dennis, I was wondering, Dennis, this is George, Dennis. I thought I'd ask you about, Dennis, do you remember that little book of mine you published? I just couldn't believe it. I did, in fact, remember the little book of his that we published.
What had the wisdom of the philosopher perceived? Where in Western thought had the Dynamo come from?
Our central assumption today is that man's essence is his freedom. Freedom without limit. Therefore, what chiefly concerns a person in this life is to shape the world as he or she wants it.
To use everything as raw material for knowing and making. What use is knowledge if you can't apply it? To master by machine and free people from work. To master disease and prolong our lives. To master nature and human nature. To master chance. But will it be good for us to control our genes? To make ourselves whatever we think we want to be? To master the universe and make it ours?
Control of the world is seen as what is essentially moral. But it would appear to me that technological progress is now being pursued not alone to free human beings from labor or disease, but for the investigation and control of nature and human nature for its own sake. Modern society is committed to technological progress as an end in itself.
If it can be done, it should be done. Change for its own sake. Where does that leave people, the individual?
With a rudderless desire to dominate on the part of our managers, and an endless search for private consolation among the powerless majority. I fear this smooth tyranny.
And in the smooth tyranny of commerce, would we be anything more than consumers? What's becoming of freedom? Freedom for what? Public impotence and private ecstasy.
Freedom for the individual is being reduced to finding one's public role in the Dynamo and then retreating into the privacies of our particular pleasures.
My will be done.
In our freedom, we now think we can decide what is valuable, what is good, what is just.
What about inalienable rights?
Many in positions of power question whether individuals do have inalienable rights, when those rights stand in the way of efficiency, in the way of progress.
And should justice be calculated as it is calculated by the powerful, by convenience?
That would be contractual justice. Rights only for those with the power to enforce a contract. technological society, our society, regards the weak as inconvenient, the old, the defenseless, the unborn. Where does that leave each and every one of us?
For after all, what ultimately measures and defines us is our love of justice. Our idea of what an individual human being is and what is owed to every human being.
The religion of progress has almost obliterated the eternal for many people, but it has not succeeded in substituting any other lasting system of meaning. In the very fullness of this presence, we are called to think what we are. Will the conquest of nature and of human nature give existence meaning? The facts of our age must be remembered. The increasing outbreaks of impersonal ferocity. The pursuit of expansion as an end in itself. The powers of manipulation now available may portend the most complete tyranny imaginable.
The owl takes its flight at twilight.
Human beings only pursue philosophy when an old system of meaning is coming to the end of its day. A terrifying darkness has fallen on modern justice. I think one has to see very clearly the great things that technology has brought into the world, for the elimination of hunger, the elimination of pain, the elimination of labor. That is certainly a fact. I'm saying it has come to be, and it's coming to be, has included a kind of dimming of knowing what human life is about. I'm saying that at one and the same time, it has brought enormous goods. And yet dimmed for us, A, what justice is, and B, dimmed for us what the purpose of human life is. All I'm saying, what if you start that human life has no given purpose? Do you see, that would be one way of saying it. This is clearly what the greatest modern philosophers have said. That the question of justice is raised because human life in itself has no given purpose.
If human life has no given purpose, then we have to make up our justice, obviously.
Yes.
If human life has
that
a
is
purpose.
exactly what I'm saying, the modern position at its clear, you put it just perfectly, Mrs. York. I think that is the position that I am arguing against in its clearest form.
Everybody assumes that there's a justice.
What is it about human beings that makes the rights of equal justice their due? What is it about any of us that makes our just due fuller than that of stones or flies or chickens or bears? I think when people are treated unjustly, even in a small way, when there's something that human beings, I mean, this may be the perfect proof of God's being, that there is something in individuals that think they ought to be treated justly when all the evidence of the world is against it, they're going to be.
The artist-philosopher's reflections on our dissolving traditions.
What I adore about your paintings is that it's there.
Yes,
that it's there, just there. That's what I want to get in philosophy, just to get what is there.
Yeah.
For me at the moment, I'm trying to write some more things about justice.
Yeah.
and to write about what I call transcendence.
Yes.
Which is both presence and absence. Now, what I find is this writing about absence
is the tough part.
it's the moment.
Yeah, the idea of void or something.
Yes.
Yeah. I of course, I'm interested in the idea of a void.
We live in darkness about the important matters, about what nature is, what a person is. We have lost a sense of what lies beyond space and time, beyond our power to manipulate and change. That's why I love this place. It gives a sense of holiness, of eternity. It reminds me that our traditions, both Greek and Christian, saw the universe as essentially good. The old beliefs recognized limits to man's abilities. They gave us a picture of nature and of man as part of an order, and not a man-made order. We cannot go back and live the past any more than we can predict the future. It is the greatest of God's dispensations that no one can prophesy the future in detail. But we can hope, though there is no hope without remembering. And we can go beyond remembering to loving. To live with courage is a virtue. Beyond courage, it is also possible to live in the ancient faith, which asserts that changes in the world take place within an eternal order that is not affected by their taking place. We can, in Virgil's words, stand with arms outstretched in love towards the further shore.
How do you handle the darkness?
To be alone with my wife would be how I would handle the darkness. Minor darknesses, drinking, I don't mean too much, but the darkness I would handle very much by living in the world, by enjoying the immediacies of the world. Well, pride and despair are considered the worst evils to Christians. And I'm guilty of very much of both of them. But I think to contemplate any time, anywhere, the affliction of men fills one with despair, doesn't it? How could it not? I don't think an ultimate world tyranny is possible, because I think human beings will always be open. Do you know what I mean? And, as Dostoevsky says, if you created the perfect world tyranny, men would break it down from boredom, because they would be open to something beyond it always.
What's down
It took me from the age of 20 until I was 30 just to cope with sex. Then it took my 30s and into my 40s to cope with earning a living for my family. Now it's taken the rest of my life to try and formulate the questions. And you silly buggers want answers.
Next week.